Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Conversations That Matter. Very special guest with us today. She is just a fountain of wisdom and knowledge and insight. Probably one of the most brilliant people I've met. It's going to be such a treat. So stay tuned. Her name is Dr. Marlene McMillan. She is her bio is so long we could spend the whole episode on it. We won't, but she's the author of Mountains of Deceit, How the Dialectical Process Has Infected the Culture. This, folks, is critical if you want to understand the true nature of political correctness, critical race theory, and so much more. She's also a international speaker. She's been known as the nation's expert on the principles of liberty. She's a graduate of John Brown University. She's got a Master of Divinity from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. If we have time, maybe we'll get into that a little bit. There's been more and more reports of liberalism creeping into some of these Baptist seminaries. She also was a professor of church and state relations at Tyndale Theological Seminary. There she got a Doctor of Ministry. She's got numerous books. They're very timely, very readable, very teachable, and she uses them to present them in weekly study groups all over the country. She does a weekly webinar, and instead of focusing on problems, this thing that she does, Why Liberty Matters, hangs what she describes as the plumb line of truth that offers lasting solutions by teaching the methodology and language that leads to liberty through individual self-government and liberty of conscience. You can check her out at whylibertymatters.com if you want to get into those weekly webinars. Marlene, thank you so much for joining us today. I want to start with the social engineering. Our society, our culture is being fundamentally transformed, and it has been fundamentally transformed already. Americans are a very different people today than they were just a generation ago, and certainly 2 or 3 generations ago. Something quite dramatic has happened in our country. Talk to us about it.
Okay, so one of the first things we're going to say is, does engineering just happen? You know, engineering by definition tells you that it's planned, and it tells you there's an engineer behind it. And social engineering is the idea that there are a group of elites who see themselves better than you, brighter than you, more capable of determining your future than yourself. And they really want to, through the use of language, transform the way you speak, the way you think, the way you make decisions, and every decision you make in your life. So we say people who live in liberty think differently than people who live in bondage. And how do you learn to think and speak differently? Well, you must be educated differently. So it's all tied together.
So give us some specific examples of the transformation, and also talk to us about how this happened. What was the process of social engineering? How did it happen so that people didn't even realize it was going on?
Well, part of being really in charge is where the masses, which is not necessarily a term I love, but where the masses think that they thought of the idea themselves. I have some of these great quotes, like from Skinner, where he says, we'll not just control what the people do, we'll control their impulses and their desires. In other words, we'll so pre-program them that they'll think it was their own idea. And these people started this out long ago. We're talking about well over 100 years ago, even before what's known as the Frankfurt School and some of the things that I know you talk about other places. But what I want the average person to know, I want people to understand how this is now everywhere in our culture. It's in the movies, in the even on the cereal boxes, on the advertisement, the premises that you are fed all the time, the things that you don't even examine. You know, when a new idea comes up and you know it's a new idea, your defenses go up and you go, oh, wow, do I embrace that or do I reject it? But if it's everywhere and everybody's saying it, you don't even realize that you have embraced an idea that if you stop to think about it, you would go, oh, that's crazy. Or I would never believe that. And yet here gradually, just step by step, it's almost like a little line at a time. You choose, you don't even realize you're choosing, but all of a sudden you end up in a place you never intended to go.
Yep. And I remember some of those from my own childhood where they kind of strategically mislead you into coming to a conclusion, and you think, aha, I came to this brilliant conclusion. And the engineers behind the scenes are laughing like, oh, exactly what we wanted. So would you say that like values clarification would fall into this category where they try to teach children that morality is subjective and that, there is no transcendent moral truths?
Well, values clarification is all about changing somebody's values. Where does a child get their values? But normally from their parents, and it used to be also from the church. Mm-hmm. But they learn things at home that were considered important to them. But in order to change that, then the schools came up with this idea of values clarification, as if your values need clarified, which is a euphemism, just a nice word to substitute, meaning we're going to control what your child believes. So we have behavior modification is also in this. And I want people to think of behavior modification as being dog training for people.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry to say that much of the parenting teaching that's going on now I'm a homeschool mom of 7, so I homeschooled all 7 of my children all the way through high school, and I didn't use dog training methods, but that's what we have in our Christian churches and schools now.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Behavioral conditioning. It's an atrocity being perpetrated against our children. Marlene, one of the areas that you have focused on is the manipulation and the changing of language to change the way we think, to change the way we act. Talk to us a little bit about that. I mean, every once in a while people hear that, it's almost cliche. The left is changing our language, but it's true, right?
Okay, so think about the term alternative lifestyle. Now, part of why I pick this is because it goes back quite a while. I mean, in the 1960s, that was new language, alternative lifestyle. But if you think about it, the people who were proposing the alternative were basically taking you off of the plumb line. But now things have gone so full circle that the people who actually believe that there is truth, who believe in right and wrong, who actually call right right and wrong wrong, those people are now considered the alternative. They're considered the extremist, when they're the ones who have just hung to the plumb line of truth all along.
Yeah, that's truly amazing. We've only got a couple of minutes left, Marlene, before we got to go to break, but talk to us a little bit about the dialectical process. A lot of people hear this. We know, Marx is associated with this terminology, but what does it actually mean? How does it work?
Okay, so dialectic by definition means 2 words. So God speaks one word, and his word is a whole, no matter how many things are going on with it. And in that one word, you have the truth is the truth, right is right, and wrong is wrong. There's a standard that is objective. So the dialectic process comes along and gives an alternative. This is called thesis antithesis. We were originally taught that the antithesis has to be the opposite. But it's much more subtle when it's just a little bit off. It's mostly right. And then it moves the person gradually and they don't even question it. And then all of a sudden they go through the transition process of the dialectic. And what this is the method or the steps by which someone is moved from a belief in absolute truth, or even that absolute truth exists, to a belief in relativism. And in my book, Mountains of Deceit, on page 11, I actually lay out the 5 steps of the dialectic process. And once you learn it, now this is kind of like taking a mental immunization, because once you see what these steps are, you'll see that they are rinsed and repeated on our culture over and over and over again. And they're used at the school board meetings, at the even in your churches, in the board meetings, and everywhere you turn, this process is used in order to move people to a predetermined conclusion. And the main part about it that's so important is that the change agent who makes this happen does it without you even realizing that it's happening.
Before we get to how do we restore liberty, and even what is the difference between liberty and freedom, I want to ask you a really obvious question that a lot of people ask to try to dismiss all of it. Well, who are they? Who is doing this to us, Marlene? Is there really some shadowy cabal that's trying to manipulate us?
Well, I think first of all, we have to remember that tyrants fill vacuums. So if there's a vacuum of thought, of idea, of governance, then people who have nefarious goals want to fill that space. So part of what I teach on is individual self-government, because the more self-governing you are, the less external government that you need. But let's go into how has this happened? And I want to jump quickly. I know our time is very limited. And I want to talk a little bit about Howard Zinn, Noam Chomsky, and some of these more recent people who have invested their lives into textbooks, curriculum, and language. And they set out purposely. So they're a they that you can actually name. You can actually look at Mary Grabar's book that explains more about her debunking Howard Zinn, and she has a book about Bill Ayers that's just absolutely outstanding. And you can see that they admit that they had a plan, which it seems to me that Christians and conservatives, not necessarily the same, many times don't have a plan. So part of what I'm about is teaching strategic thinking and teaching people to take control or take control, but take ownership of your ideas, of where did your thoughts come from? Why do you believe what you believe? And will your beliefs hold up against the real trials of life?
Yeah, excellent. And we actually have interviewed Mary Grabar before. She has done some stupendous work. I mean, they're just lying, right? It's not like they're being deceived. They're just openly lying. Marlene, I want to ask you maybe the most important question of all. How do we resist this? How do we turn back the tide? Is it possible to turn back the tide, or is our culture, is our society too far gone? If it is possible, how do we do it? And how do we protect our children?
Well, there's never a bad time to go back to the basics. The truth is always the truth. And good character, even if it looks like the guy who cheats and steals and lies is being rewarded, that's a temporary reward. So we have to reset our values to where we value the thing that lasts the longest. Franklin said, he who would exchange essential liberty for temporary safety deserves neither liberty nor safety. And we have to teach our children to have the good character, the long-term character, to see that life is for eternity and they have a kingdom purpose. And there's a reason that they were born for such a time as this. And in that process, that they will answer for what they believe and for the choices that they make. And so life is a series of choices. And if we are going to rebuild a culture, I actually use the term refounding, and I have a whole set of teachings about refounding a nation. And I'm sorry to say, I'd love to say the premise is that everything's redeemable and it's going to be wonderful. But many times for there to be restoration in more truth and purity, there has to be a purging, and that purging is painful. And people have to repent of buying up into ways that are displeasing to God and that lead to tyranny instead of liberty. Because see, people who live in liberty think differently than people who live in bondage and tyranny. And liberty is built on a fixed set of principles. And my book, 5 Pillars of Liberty, actually teaches what those are and gives you an introduction into how to think like a person who lives in liberty.
Yeah, and I've got several of your books. You do incredible work. Tell us a little bit about that. What does liberty mean? You draw a sharp distinction between liberty and freedom. Explain that to us. And in your view, what does liberty mean?
Okay, so liberty is the opportunity to make a choice, to assume responsibility. Oh, but here it gets really difficult. And accept the consequences. In other words, if you're going to live in liberty, there isn't somebody who's always going to bail you out. There are consequences, cause and effect of the choices that you make. And that's part of adulthood. The day that you assume responsibility for your choices is the day you become an adult. And I don't care whether you're 8 and I know maybe you can't drive and those things, but an 8-year-old can make a choice about many of these things. They can make it much younger than people think, even down to 3. Now, freedom is a word that disregards responsibility. And freedom is more about the claiming the opportunity to do wrong. In other words, it's a license word. It doesn't think about the consequences. It just says, I want to do what I want to do, when I want to do it, the way I want to do it, and I'll decide whether I hurt anybody else or not. So freedom is more like the license to do wrong, and liberty is the right to do right. And we quote often from Brent Winters, who says, no man has a right to do wrong. And so I want our listeners to think about that. I want people to think about, why do you have so much encroachment from outside? Why do you have so many tyrants coming around? Well, it has to do with wanting someone else to blame and somebody else to bail us out. And that's something we're going to have to repent from.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned something a little while ago about this purging that's necessary, this repentance that's necessary before we can rebuild or refound on a solid foundation. What does that look like? We've only got a couple minutes left, but what does it look like? Do you think it's possible? What do you see for America going forward?
Well, first of all, judgment begins at the house of God.
Mm-hmm.
And part of it has to do with the idea of realignment of our priorities and confessing that a lot of what we spend our time and energy on are temporal things and don't last for eternity. And so in the process of that, in my book, Declaration of Dependence, I go into this, because when we declared independence from England, we did not declare independence from God. In fact, we declared our dependence. So it's Declaration of Dependence, how to heal our nation through prayer. And it's really a cultural training manual on biblical thinking. And so what has happened as a nation is we've gotten all mixed up in our ideas. But when there is a real awakening, when there's a great awakening, you see a change in how people do money, in how they educate their children, the way they spend their time, the things they think about, what they care about, the celebrity culture of, I'm feeding the flesh all the time and having to have constant entertainment and reward. All of that stuff just kind of flitters away. And when you see people's values realign, and you see, especially when you get into money, I know a lot of people say, oh, it's all about religion. No, it's about money. And if you deal with it, if you see the people have, the idea that you can't serve two gods. You can't serve God and mammon. And mammon is that desire that always wants more. It's never satisfied. So godliness with contentment is great gain. And when you see people content, the word is enough, the truth is enough. It changes consumerism, materialism, all these things that there's organizations fighting against. All of that can be dealt with through a change of heart. So I really deal the most with character. And I want to encourage, especially homeschool parents, to train character. Yes, academics matter, but folks, you can go look up the date in a book, but you can't actually buy character. Character comes from within. Focus on character and the rest of it will fall into place.
Very good. Brilliant advice, Dr. McMillan. WhyLibertyMatters.com. Any other websites you want to mention where people can find your work?
That's the best place to go. We have webinars every Wednesday night. We have a global audience and people tune into our webinars, and it's for leaders of leaders. Come join us.
Fantastic. Dr. Marlene McMillan, folks, go check it out, WhyLibertyMatters.com. I'm Alex Newman. This is Conversations That Matter for the New American Magazine. Until next time, God bless you all.